Percent of the time, I have no idea what I'm talking about.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
It's not. It
gets the people going.
You're now listening to Diagnonsense.
Look at all this damage!
With Justin Pendergrass and Kurt Honak.
You are a sad, strange little man.
Then we would just be idiots saying nonsense.
So spirit animals.
I know that Kurt definitely has a spirit animal. I don't know what it is.
I don't know. I've been told I look from, I look like the German Shepherd from All Dogs Go to Heaven, so I guess that's supposed to be my spirit
Specifically
animal.
that German Shepherd? Or
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a German
Is that
Shepherd?
Charlie?
Specific, yeah, Charlie. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but with spirit animals, it's more about personality than it is about
Yeah, I was
looks,
gonna say
correct?
that guy's not a I wouldn't call Charlie a villain, but he's definitely not a good guy.
He's an anti-hero?
Yeah.
That's what
That does. Now you're making
He's
a
kinda
case
like
for
the
it
Punisher.
to be Kurt. I mean,
yeah.
Kurt is the Punisher.
That's my classmate, my peer, told me that's what I look like. I told her she looked like one of the sloths from Ice Age.
Nice. Well, that's a classic. I mean,
Was that because you were upset? Because I
No,
wouldn't necessarily
no,
want to tell somebody
no,
that ever.
She really did
That's a
see the
little
resemblance. and she
that's a
thought
bit
it was funny.
argumentative. I
She
think
thought
I
it
had.
was funny.
I think I had that told to me as well when I was
What's-
playing juniors.
You could
look
be
like
the little
Sid the
dog
Sloth.
that follows Charlie around, Isaac.
I've never seen All Dogs Go to Heaven.
All right, we're going to have to move on from this before
So-
I get upset. How dare you?
I know.
How do you
I've
know
never
where
seen
dogs
that.
go?
I-
How do you know
I
where they
don't know.
go?
How do you
If
know
you
where
haven't
they
seen
go?
the movie.
How do you?
I've seen the
I
movie.
assume they go to heaven. I mean, at least in the movie, that's what the title would imply.
Well,
I mean,
that's
Yeah.
just assuming. I mean,
is
I
it
need
like
you to watch it? So
is
you
it
can
like one of
verify.
those titles where it deliberately throws you off, and it's actually like a Doom arc where the dogs like
No,
fight like?
I don't know. The one scene that I saw from it, because I never watched it, was where he brings scraps to all the puppies. So I was like, well, I work at a homeless drop-in center for youth, so that's pretty fair.
You didn't bring them scraps. He brought them an entire pizza.
Oh, an entire pizza. Yeah, he actually, they were like upscale.
What's
eating.
happening in here? Am I the only one who has watched that?
Probably.
There's
No.
a singing in there. There's like this weird crocodile lady.
I don't have kids, and I understand that movie came out when I was probably a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
very
did
much
not-
did.
But I didn't watch it when
91,
I was
I
a kid,
think.
and I won't have an excuse to watch it until I have kids of my own. So.
Uh-oh.
Well, at that point, you don't have to because technology has advanced far past the quality of that movie.
Well, no, it's hand drawn. It's animation, though, right?
Timeless.
I mean, yeah, it's like timeless animation. That's like saying you won't watch the original Lion King because technology will have advanced.
We're going to have
past-
to put this entire podcast on hold while we go watch that movie real
Okay.
quick so that we
So-
can reference it accordingly because you guys are just flowing all around here. Oh, my gosh.
Michelle, have you seen All Dogs Go to Heaven?
I have not.
Okay,
Oh
so it's just Justin. Great topic discussion.
Oh my gosh.
Great
Thank
job.
you guys for tuning into Diagnonsense. I'm your host, Justin Pendergrass. I'm here with Kurt Honak. How you doing, Kurt?
Doing good.
Awesome. We're going to have a guest today, and we're going to be talking about a bill. What is this?
But first, we're going to go to housekeeping.
No, we're going to skip housekeeping today like we always
So
do.
anyway, housekeeping-wise, there's certain stuff coming up, stuff and things. Golf tournament in July. I was instructed to let people know that it is National Cat Adoption Month. That was Roger from 9 Star.
Oh,
It's Cat
That's
Adoption
important,
Month.
yeah.
And apparently the Valley isn't taking any more cats. So if you ever wanted like a cat or a dog, are you going to unzip your jacket on my podcast right now? Are you
Yeah.
kidding me? What, is your
Sample
phone
it.
still off silent too?
sample it for a song.
You sample it for a song. You're the artist here. You're the creative type. Why don't you sample it for a song?
Deal. All right, deal.
Okay, bet. Also, podcasts came out and are coming out. It's actually like the 10th episode of everything coming up next week. That's pretty exciting, I think. I
Yeah.
mean, I thought
We
that this
made it.
podcast would make it to like 4, so we're well exceeding expectations at this point.
Kurt carries us all the way through.
I mean, probably because he's a big German Shepherd from All Dogs Go to Heaven.
true.
That's true.
Just- Anyway, you can introduce our guest now, probably, if you want to do your job.
Hey, Kurt, why don't you introduce our guest
Okay.
and then talk about what we're going to be talking about today real quick?
Okay.
We'll
Our
kinda
guest is
thumb through
Michelle
this.
Overstreet. So We
Oh.
can't say anything too politically divisive. we'll get fired. No, but no, seriously though, Michelle Overstreet. So, and we're going to be talking about HB 172.
Yeah.
And the crisis now kind of approach.
Michelle, so from what I understand, you had a lot of input into this bill. Am I wrong?
Well, I certainly supported it as part of a group of people that were trying to do mobile crisis teams and 23-hour crisis stabilization in lieu of congregate shelter for homeless. And the challenge is that in every city across the nation where they have created congregate shelter, without the wraparound services and job training and a continuum that has an exit strategy, they end up with overwhelming numbers of homeless that ultimately end up kind of ruining downtown areas, which we saw in Anchorage, but we've also seen in Portland, Seattle, Oakland, California, Chicago, Boston. All these cities that set up congregate shelters end up with disastrous outcomes. So what we tried to do was create a continuum of care for our valley that utilizes, certainly the My House model, but also this legislation is supporting a 23-hour crisis stabilization and a mobile crisis team. So the mobile crisis team is really genius because what happens with the mobile crisis team is instead of the police coming and arresting someone who's having a behavioral health situation or in the wake of an overdose where someone is Narcaned, instead of an ambulance coming for a behavioral health situation and taking them to a hospital that may or may not have beds for behavioral health, you've got somebody who is a trained professional. In our model, there's a peer support person alongside that trained professional. So you've got a behavioral health team that goes out and says, okay, we understand that you're having a problem with addiction or with behavior, with depression. Maybe the person is suicidal, and you can bring them to a crisis stabilization center using that mobile crisis team. So it doesn't take the time from the police. It doesn't take an ambulance. It doesn't take an emergency room visit where in our ER, a lot of times people are parked in the hallway waiting for 24 hours and sometimes even days before they get actually seen for a behavioral health situation. They go to a 23-hour crisis stabilization center. They can be evaluated there. They can be triaged so that they can have a doorway open into a substance use treatment program.
Yeah.
They can go into a behavioral health program. If they need to be hospitalized, they can go to a hospital, but they do it through that doorway instead of the ER, where that's more of a life or death. Somebody's coming in there with a gunshot wound. You know, there's a big difference between those two. So what we'd like to do is have this be part of our continuum and circumvent the need for that big congregate shelter that are so easily runaway trains, and really actually meet the needs of our community members.
I like that. Not only because of the ability to be able to meet people where they're at in their circumstances and meet them in their crisis, but also this allows an opportunity for those people who are disconnected from our community out in the middle of this, the streets and in these unsafe environments to have an opportunity to connect with individuals with lived experience and with the ability to be able to help them through stuff.
Right.
So,
Camps.
yeah.
Camps. You could have a mobile crisis team that visited a homeless camp and say, this person is unconscious because they've been doing whippets all night. We just had an experience with that with our organization. They're unconscious. Let's get them into, we have actually had an ambulance donated for our mobile crisis team. So our behavioral health crisis team will be in an ambulance that's marked for behavioral health crisis.
That's so cool.
It's so good.
I
Thank
remember.
you. Yeah, shout out.
I remember seeing that, and it's so cool.
Shout out to Matsu Valley Fire and Rescue for that. Ken and the team up at the fire station that offered that for us. It's just such a huge benefit.
So I know that you had a couple of reservations about this, Kurt. And I just wanted to kind of touch on those a little bit. I know that overall, from what I understand, you're more in support than not, but there was some things that were red flags for you going in. Am I
think,
right?
So I just kind of learned about it within the past few months. So it's been in the works for, I think, about 2 years.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so I mean, I'm just kind of like getting up to speed with it. And, you know, I know that there's been some amendments that have gone through since the bill started. And regarding concern about, I know one of the things I heard was an amendment so that people are notified, like if their child is placed in involuntary care. I think, and I'm still learning about it. And when I talked to a couple people from the Mental Health Trust when I went down to Sitka for the Mental Health Board for the state of Alaska, and talking to them, you know, they're really, the objective is to reduce involuntary hospitalizations, right? So to reduce the kind of heavy-handed approach that communities and the government kind of has, because you know, they don't really have an intermediate level of intervention, from my understanding of what this is. I guess my reservations are just like, you know, I just feel like there's a lot of potential still for, if it's not executed correctly, for things to go wrong. I just think that looking at the history of, you know, psychiatry in this country, it's just been very, I view it as very abusive to our population. And I just think that it's just got to be executed correctly. And the more I learn about it, the more I see that, you know, True North and some of the people that I've met that have talked about it, talk about, you know, having a recovery mentality about it, so that it's more geared toward like peer support and not necessarily like the old institutional powers that be, which I like. I think that you have to, I think that part of one of the greatest tragedies about the way psychiatry is executed in our country is we have people dispensing drugs that have never personally been on those substances, so they don't really know what they do. And I think I think that it's easy for somebody to separate people out into a top-down management system where it's like, okay, so you're dispensing drugs and you don't know how those feel personally, but you're supposed to manage this situation with this person, but you have no lived experience on what they're actually going through. So I think that has to be mindful. I think the peer support approach or the recovery-based language that they use, indicates that they are not coming at it from this top-down sort of, the DSM is the, what would you say, like the written word is the law of the land kind of mentality, where, you know, they're going, you know, this is set in stone as a chemical imbalance, even though there's no objective scientific proof for any of that stuff. And we have to administer antipsychotic or psychotropic drugs. However, the bill is worded that could be part of the process. Where it gets tricky, I think, is where this is why I'm not for abolishment of psychiatric drugs, right? Because where it gets tricky is if somebody's going through a post-acute withdrawal from a psychiatric drug, like Peter Breggin talks about, reinstating that drug at the level they were on before the withdrawal will stabilize them. But the challenge you have is that, you know, that is not necessarily that drug doesn't necessarily solve that, you know, psychosis in general, right? Like,
right.
We've been using these drugs for things that they're not actually designed to do. And, so my concern is that, okay, so we're doing involuntary treatment with drugs that are, you know, are they being used for what they actually do? And is, you know, the other thing would be like, you know, it is that person, you know, Well, I think that's the greatest challenge of it, right? Is that are the drugs being used in the context that's appropriate? And I just don't see that in the history of psychiatry. And that's why it's scary to me, right? Is that there's scary parts of it because, historically, if you look at psychiatry, it's like, it's really, rooted in, we want to manage people's crisis, and, the roots of that are even theocratically based. They're not based in objective scientific crisis resolution to me.
So I think, Kurt, one of the biggest benefits to what we're looking at here is having the recovery piece in place with the peer support, because I'm just a firm believer that if what we're talking about doing is helping people get clean and sober, and we know from our data here that about 86% of people that are struggling, particularly to keep housing, are struggling with a substance use disorder. So if we've got a recovery program that's partnering on this project or leading the project, I feel like that's a step in the right direction. I don't disagree with you, by the way. I think this legislation has the potential to be derailed. I think there are, if you're somebody who's a believer in those, the black ops, political dissidents are going to be taken from the streets and put in these involuntary programs.
We love talking about that on this podcast.
Well, can I just tell you that that's where the DSM's rooted? I mean, it's rooted in the Inquisition, and it's a spiritual successor to the Inquisition's document on witch hunting. I mean, if you want to get technical about it, let's go crazy.
Right, I'm not disagreeing.
Spanish Inquisition.
So just understand, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I do see the value of this for our community. And the alternative to this is that congregate shelter, and you kind of gather everybody up and just let them do whatever it is that they want to do.
It's a holding place. It's not a healing place.
And there's no exit. Right? The exit has to include those behavioral health treatments and sobriety, or there really isn't any exit. That person is still in bondage.
So I think that what I like the most about this is it takes more of a humanistic approach than I think anything that really we've been doing for mental health for a long time. It takes the humanistic abilities that we've all have to just be true and authentic, and puts it right at the forefront of what we're doing. So you show up as a person and you help this person in crisis. You don't have to be anything different.
Right.
Right? Because, Kurt, your experiences that you're sharing with us now, that's valuable. You showing up on a call where this person's been, detoxing off of whatever psych meds they've been on, you know what that looks like. You're able to be like, yeah, this is what's going on. Let me sit with this person and talk them through it. I show up to a suicide call where somebody's really struggling with their life. I'm able to sit with them in that moment. I'm able to feel through it with them, and I think that this allows humans to be humans in really the most human moment that there is, crisis and heaviness and the hardships that they're facing in those moments. And I do love that it's taken an approach that nowhere else really is. Right? I mean, there's a couple places piloting it and like trying to figure out what it looks like, but we're trying to avoid saying, "Oh, you're homeless? Come here."
Yeah.
Live in our backyard and do what you've been doing in every other place. No, we're not saying don't come here. We're saying if you come here, this is how we're going to help you.
Well, and we're not enabling. That means that we're not enabling anymore. This really, in many ways, connects back to your last podcast that was about the revision, because it's about connecting. Yeah. It's about not leaving people alone, not just dumping them in a congregate shelter and saying, "Have a nice day." We know from our work here.
Attaboy. Yeah.
Yeah. We've had young people come here from congregate shelter who experienced trauma at the shelter. So
saying, I'm afraid I can't be here. I'm scared.
Yes. So
I've been harmed here.
In the scope of that, and with sensitivity to what Kurt's talking about, because I really feel strongly that if somebody's coming into a crisis stabilization situation, and let's say they're detoxing from alcohol, right? That can be deadly. So we have to have the next step on this is going to be a detox program.
100%.
And it needs to be in place as soon as we can get it up and running. The challenge with that is that there are so many different factions and organizations and politics and funding dynamics around a detox center. No one wants it in their backyard. Certain people want to run it, but they want to run it subsidized by another organization. Certain organizations don't want it run by a certain other organization. We get into the politics of it. But the bottom line is that in order to really make this work and to avoid what Kurt's talking about, and some of those dynamics where people are involuntary committed for 72 hours, we need a detox center for them to transition into from the 23-hour stabilization. And we will have that. We will get that.
I want to talk about something that Kurt had brought up a couple minutes ago, where we were talking about the theocratic roots of a lot of psychology-based mental health care stuff. And I think, Kurt, where I think it's easy for people to agree. I know that there's, and certainly in the human services industry, and I'll use the word industry again because even though it's, nonprofits, it is somewhat of an industry. There is a lot of religious-based organizations, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. But we talk a lot about humanistic connection, and the reason why I think that's so important is, and you'll hear it from people that are through recovery, is you actually heard it on my voice with one of our current client navigators who said, and they're now a born-again believer, but what they said was when they were first trying to get clean, they weren't ready for the Jesus stuff.
Yes.
They weren't ready for the religious stuff. And I think that for people that are actively in crisis, for some people that works and that's exactly what they need. But for a lot of other people, they don't need something religious at that moment to break that cycle. They need a humanistic connection. And if you are someone who is religious, I think the way you should be looking at this when we talk about kind of these more secular services and connections is that if you want someone, even if you want someone to go into a religious service later, or you're a Christian, for example, and you believe that they should, you want them to be saved and be a believer. Sometimes to get to that point, to stay alive, to get to that point, they just need another person to talk to them on a person. I think whether or not you're religious or you're agnostic, there's the need for just what you said, Justin, allow humans to be humans is so important to get them to that next step and to get someone out of active crisis.
Well, and I want to say something about that, what you're saying right now, if that's okay. I know the question was directed to Kurt, but I've been working at my house for almost 4 years, and I was working with this young woman who, adamantly against Christ. I never mentioned to her, but I knew her heart because she would voice it. And I'll tell you that, role modeling that behavior, having those conversations when they're asked, wait until they're asked. Mm-hmm. You don't have to push it down their throat. They're going to ask when they say, "What are you doing?" That's when your opportunity is to share that stuff. In a crisis, I never mention Christ, ever. I'm a believer. I love God very much, and I will say that to anybody who asks. But I do not mention him when I'm in a crisis because that's not going to help every single person in a crisis. It's actually going to put up a wall. They're going to instantly stop engaging, and they're going to turn the other way and possibly do what I'm there to stop them from. Right? I can role model God. I can role model the behaviors that I believe in and the spirituality that I have without even saying his name. And if you're a believer and you know that, it says that in the Bible. It talks about these things. It teaches us those things, right? You don't have to shove Christ down someone's throat to tell them that, that they're loved. When I have a client who's struggling, I tell them that I love them because I truly and genuinely do. And I want them to know, it doesn't have to be anything more than that. I get to be a person in that moment. I don't have to be Justin, the Christian rapper. I don't have to be Justin, the suicide prevention. I don't have to be Justin, the case manager. I get to be Justin Pendergrass, the human being. And that's what I think that is super exciting about this Crisis Now model, is that we get a chance to go out and be humans, really some of us for the first time in our lives, you know? And I think that's beautiful. I do see the potential of this being harmful. I do see the potential of a lot of things being harmful, though, just like religion. We can beat that dead. Religion is very harmful, you know? Part of why Alaska was colonized, you know? So part of, you know, the psychiatric problems in our states and in our world are, you know, there's Christians at the helm, you know? There's tons of hurt in that. And it's our responsibility as believers to stop hurting people and start meeting them in their circumstances as human beings, which is what we've been called to do in the first place. Not pass judgment, not be in those moments with people and be like, well, your circumstance is not as bad as mine ever was. You know?
Yeah. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I'm not ragging on the...
Not at all.
I'm not trying to rag on theocratic approaches or religious beliefs, because obviously, as we've seen with the scientific community, is that the objective scientific evidence, if it's being, you know, conducted by firms that are paid off by the companies that conduct them, you know, that are paying them to conduct that research, then, you know, that's obviously just as muddied as any other, you know, ideology or belief about the right way to do things. So
yeah, 100%. But and I know this took a really weird turn, but I like it.
I just think it's an interesting conversation about theocracy in crisis situations, but also in, you know, pharmaceutical and psychology stuff. Especially because Michelle, and I was talking to you about a different subject as it relates to this the other day, but when you got your degrees, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was the 80s, right? When you had graduated college. And so now 1990. So you were in school in the late 80s, correct?
Right,
Yeah, okay.
Right.
So
DSM-3R is what I was trained on.
And so that means that you've seen kind of several revisions now to those DSM.
Which one are we on now? Five,
I believe.
Revised text RT. It was not. It wasn't even publicized. So,
wow.
I mean, unless they changed that just recently, but it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and so that means that you kind of have a unique perspective in like how stuff has changed and where some of this stuff is based. Like some of these, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that it works is these like revisions that are in the DSM-5 right now, that makes the baseline for eventually DSM-6. And so you've seen the process of these revisions and now how things have moved along.
How many retractions have happened? Like they changed it and they were like, actually, we're wrong. Do they do that at all?
Well, not specifically. It's very, very rare that anyone admits that they were wrong in that venue. But there have been.
Kurt.
Yes.
But there was a situation in the 90s where alcoholism was considered a disability. And so if you were diagnosed with alcoholism, you could take that to Social Security and collect Social Security disability for being an alcoholic. And there was a whole movement around, you know, when we start talking about enabling and recovery and trying to create a recovery movement in a community.
Where you're paid to be a drunk.
Right. That was one of the things that was, they did back that out, but it was a Social Security Administration reversal. It was not necessarily a DSM reversal. The DSM was just being used. And so that's also where some of that, instead of being considered a condition that you were diagnosed with and then you never left that behind, it became, you could go into remission, right? That you're in recovery. And so that's kind of where that transition took place as well, where we started talking about, yes, I was diagnosed with a substance use disorder, but I've been in recovery for however many years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. Michael Carson talks about, I think he celebrated 36 years in recovery this year.
It's something close to that, yeah.
It's just an incredible amount of time working that program and staying clean. So that would be an example of the role of the DSM and some of those dynamics. What's really interesting about that diagnostic statistic manual, that's what DSM stands for, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, is that there are specific criteria for diagnosing any of those behavioral health concerns, including addiction. So you can go in and open up that book and look at what the diagnostic criteria are for alcohol dependence or for borderline personality disorder or whatever it is, schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And you know, you can measure yourself technically
self-diagnose.
on that. Right.
Yeah, I need
on that
marijuana
scale.
to fix this. Kind of thing.
Yes, right. Yeah, this is my chosen treatment, right? Yeah. And so most of the time, and this sort of lends itself to what Kurt's talking about, oftentimes there will be accepted modes of treatment for that. For example, if you're diagnosed with major depression, then you have a parallel path where people say, okay, so antidepressants would be an option for treating that. Bipolar disorder, there are some medication options for treating that. What we missed is that human connection and the peer support for each one of those. There should be people who have survived this and how they survived, and their experience should be valued on that same platform as the pharmaceutical companies. The challenge is that they don't have the money for advertising and lobbying and all the things that.
So that's the X factor in all this is biological determinism or social Darwinism. And that's, I guess that's why I have the fear, right, about bills like HB 172, because when things are good and they're supposed to work as appropriately and there's appropriate supervision and interest, then yeah, they work as intended. But just like with everything, it's like you get the wrong people in there or you get the wrong oversight, and all of a sudden, we are interning people into involuntary medicalization because the federal government decided that, actually, like let's say we're in war in 10 years and we have to intern people. So that's really where I see this going, even though I understand why it would be helpful and useful. And that may be unpreventable anyway, because we've got things like Title 47 where we do that anyway. So, and it's for the mentally ill. But the problem is that we can't, just as you've seen in your lifetime, we've had so many revisions to the DSM that it sounds like we're having a hard time defining what mental illness is. And I wonder why.
Well, here's a really...
I mean, I know why, but it's rhetorical.
Right. Here, an interesting sidebar to that, Kurt, is really that I think as a community, we have to hold space for what we want and be willing to step in the gap and represent for what we want. Just within the last 6 months, I was referred to as transphobic in a meeting. Somebody in the meeting called me transphobic, and my question back was, do you know the diagnostic criteria for transphobia?
Right.
Because there is a set of select criteria that would diagnose that. I do not meet those criteria. I don't believe the person who accused me of that knew what the criteria were, but it's become a catch term or a term used to manipulate people in conversations because nobody wants to be labeled with that. Right?
Well, it's like Thomas Sauce said, the Protestant and Catholic battles, were to try and expunge the Antichrist from each other. And in the modern age, that looks like communism and capitalism, fighting it out by calling each other, if you don't agree with me, then you're mentally ill. And that's my fear, is that we use the mental health care systems being used as a political weapon. And it's not actually serving, it's not actually to make people better, but it's to control social dissent.
But my response to that person in that meeting was, I don't think that you understand what the criteria are or can diagnose me with the credentials to diagnose me with that. And I'm not accepting that. It's not appropriate in this venue. And we have to be better than that as a community. We have to move away from labeling people that disagree with us and saying, you've got this grievous condition because you're not agreeing with me or doing what I say that I think you should do.
Right.
And that's where, as a community, we hold space for what we want this to be. And if we can work together and hold space for that and have a cohesive platform, I think this is a really nice alternative to, and a caring alternative to, some of the mass shelters and the places where people are just parked in a corner, even if it's the ER, because there's no time to provide services for them. God help our ER doctors and nurses. So my hope,
Amen.
Kurt, is that we don't create that, and that if we do start going in that direction, we've got people that stand in that gap, and like you and I, and say,
Right.
wait, this is not how we do it. This is not what this is meant for.
Well, and now you have that ability to be able to say that to some people who will be listening, with you being on the mental health board too. Mm-hmm. You're in front of some people who you'll be like, hey, I don't like that that's what we're pushing for. You know,
Right.
I like that you have that ability now, Kurt, because it allows your voice to be heard. And I heard a couple of people talking about their experience when you spoke.
Yeah.
And every one of them told me how powerful it was.
Yeah, it's very much appreciated, and it's very well respected. And I think there's room. I think there's room for all of us at this table. But really, and you alluded to this earlier, the most important voices are going to be the voices of those who have already walked through fire. You know, this is where the people who have crossed the burning bridge go back with buckets of water for the people that are on their way, right?
Right.
And shield.
Well, yeah. I mean, that as long as it's being used as intended, right? But I mean, you could say that about any tool or any system, right? And so, I guess it will just take careful consideration and monitoring, to see it. But I mean, like I said earlier too, though, I do see a lot of good potential in it. But like any tool, it has, the potential for.
Look at history.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
the Bible's been used for evil 100 times, and it's supposed to be this greatest book of all time.
Right.
I'm sure all kinds of religious documents have, and so, yeah, so.
I mean, looking at it from an outside perspective too, what it seems like it kind of comes down to is who are the people making decisions? Because it's pretty easy to make the case that, I mean, you can't say that, well, we should never be able to involuntarily intern people. I mean, there are individuals whose mental state or, even like serial killers, it's pretty easy to say, like, man, if someone is willing to go out there and kill, 70 people, obviously everything isn't perfectly all right, like upstairs. Or if someone is an absolute danger to themselves, or even in some cases with dementia patients, like you can make arguments for why certain people should be involuntarily interned. But then, Kurt, where I see what you're saying is how many times have we seen people taking advantage of elderly folks using dementia or other, illnesses like that as a crutch to just take people's money.
Especially when we're seeing studies come out that these psych drugs are tied to dementia in the long-term outcomes. Yeah, in the elderly accelerate or, I mean, that's a real thing. There's a real amount of social cannibalism that happens.
Right. So to me, it comes down to who you need to have people in place that are A, qualified to make those decisions, and B, have a passion for. Maybe that means they have lived experience. Maybe that means that's just what their passion is helping individuals that can make those decisions for the people that would be sent to or involuntarily held to get clean or sober or to stabilize, but then also for the community as a whole to know, like, which individuals, and it's going to be the majority of individuals that can return to the community and be given a chance to be a functioning member of society. You need people in place that are making those decisions for the good of the community as a whole and for the good of individuals. But then the problem is, and where I see why you have a concern is, we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have access to 20 just, what's the D&D chart where it's like truly like good, lawful good or
lawful
whatever.
good.
There's not like 20 people that perfectly just
lawful
slot
good.
into their lawful good and they're always going to make the perfect decision. So as community members, we need to be electing individuals and if it's not a position where it's an electable position, we need to be doing whatever we can to influence the decision makers or the people that are electing individuals, so that we have people on these boards that can make those decisions that are going to the best of our abilities, represent what's best for the community and what's best for these individuals. Because we live in an imperfect world, and
if you don't have that, you're going to have a manufactured problem where the cure is worse than a disease, because you get 10 people sicker today, and then it's 20 tomorrow, and then 30, and then 40.
Right.
And so on and so forth.
Part of what I love about this is the peer support model going hand in hand with that behavioral health specialist. And the peer support piece is so critical because those people have actually been on the ground. Kurt, your lived experience in those circumstances with people that are being diagnosed and having medications recommended to them could be critical and invaluable to them. And right. I'm going to describe a situation where, somebody who has been in long-term psychiatric treatment and been through and exposed to dozens and dozens of drugs, then all of a sudden they decide that they want to try without the drugs and detox from everything that they've been on for years. And then they're diagnosed by that same practitioner with a personality disorder because they're perceived as non-compliant, which is really bizarre. But it falls in line with the model that you're describing.
Right. Well, anosognosia, I believe anosognosia, medically, in medical terminology, you can be diagnosed as not recognizing you're mentally ill because you're so mentally ill. So that happens to people,
right.
and then they, that's bad. Yeah.
Well, and it's also it's also sort of a symptom of conditions like borderline personality disorder, where it's considered untreatable because the person who has it will never admit that they have it. It's always about blaming and shifting.
They say I have this thing.
Yeah, that it's not for real. But the peer support piece of that, walking alongside and that human-to-human contact, creates a platform for having difficult conversations around what you're experiencing and what may really be going on. It gives an opportunity for the person who's detoxing or trying meds for the first time to be able to talk to somebody who's experienced that and can say, I did, I know how you feel. I felt that same way. Here's what I found. You got to stick it out a little while, or, maybe this, or making some suggestions that are practical on the ground suggestions. And it also, I think, gives a little bit more time for processing what's happening in terms of those behavioral health treatments, as opposed to some of the people who maybe have 15 minutes at a time to meet with somebody about their medication management. And we know we've had clients before where they go in for a med management appointment and we've been watching them struggle, and they come out 20 minutes later with another prescription on top of the 3 that they already have, and that's the solution. And so when we have peer support that spend an hour and a half processing that and make another appointment to go back in and reevaluate, that's more valuable than the 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
That the client had. So having that balance of lived experience and lived support for the person, combined with that professional knowledge of the DSM and what those diagnostics look like, how they present in real life, and what are the strategies for working through those to get to the other side. When we talk about, we don't just want it to be a cycle. And Kurt, that speaks back to what your concerns about the industry, the pharmaceutical company, the counseling industry, because sometimes purpose of the appointment is to schedule the next appointment. It's to get the people on the drugs that are the most profitable, that are the most reimbursable, rather than getting them clean and sober. And so the peer support for me really has the opportunity to walk people through the exit strategy on that.
Yeah. Well, I like this conversation because I feel a little better about it. I think that if we're going to be doling out these medications, that certainly peer support approaches need to be included, and this is probably a lot better than any other alternative. Then, because I mean, if the core fundamental issue is not addressed, then this is the next best thing. And I think it's a cultural shift that has to happen. I don't think it's an overnight process, because we're talking about psychology, theocracy. We're talking about, political stuff. And I know it's not going to be an overnight process. And so maybe this is, not just a Band-Aid, but a
step 1A,
step one,
a movement.
to go the other direction then. So I feel better about it in that context. Yeah, for sure then.
Yeah, but I share your concerns, because the way that the law is written, there's no question about the fact that it could be misused. And we'll have to stay vigilant, and really what we're trying to create here is a movement, right? Right.
Well, to reduce involuntary treatment, it's not to increase, and it's not to, misuse it. So
right. A paradigm shift, right?
Well, and I think that the cool thing about this is it's going to stop the future ones.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It not only does this help the current, this allows for the future crisis that's going to take place throughout, generations, as we're making changes and things. This is going to allow for that healing to take place earlier rather than later. 40 years into your homelessness experience. This allows for us to meet you, maybe at 18.
Right.
And start that healing process, start that treatment goal, start that process to move forward, so you don't waste 30 years of your life on this thing where you don't feel like you have another solution. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy the Crisis Now model. I think it's an amazing model. I'm really excited to see it roll out. I think that this bill is just, like I said, step 1A in a long process of things. We're going to get down to Z. Step 26, it's going to be a never-ending change and shift as we're trying to find the appropriate way to deal with mental health and heal people through their hurts. So,
and can I shout out to peer support? Really, the magic in this is the people with lived experience and the people with peer support. So if you're somebody in recovery that would like to be involved in helping others, and you've got at least a year clean, get that peer support certificate. Message Justin or Kurt. Either one of them can help you figure out how to do that. Justin at myhousematsu.org or Kurt at KURT at myhousematsu.org. We can share with you the link for the state certification program and become part of the solution. Be part of the solution.
We're going to wrap this up. Thank you guys for tuning in to Diagnonsense. I'm your host, Justin Pendergrass, here with my co-host, Kurt Honak. Kurt, do you have anything else? Final thoughts?
I just think that there's still a lot of potential for healing and a lot of potential for good out of this, and I think that with peer supports and people with lived experience, they have a vested interest because they are the people that are going through this. So as long as we keep people who are affected have a voice at the table, I think it will go good.
Yeah. Awesome. Find somebody to connect with this week, and we'll see you guys next time.